Number 7. Aleister Crowley believed and taught sexual abuse of children for ritual as well as child sacrifice. In 1904, Crowley had a communication with an extraterrestrial being demon named EWAS, and this being, though Crowley's wife, kind of a channeling type operation, brought forth a book that was called the Book of the Law in 1904. And this book declared that the slain and risen God had stepped off the throne and that a new God, the crowned and conquering child, was taking his place. And he began doing rituals to bring forth this crowned and conquering child, and he began to start what he called the cult of the fascinating child, and in doing so he uncovered without knowing it the royal secret of masonry. And what happened was, a gentleman came knocking at his door after he published a book. And in this book, it was a book of poetry, and in the book he had made an allusion to something, and this guy, his name was Theodore Royce. He was a German occultist and head of the OTO, which is Ordo, Templar, Templi, Orientis, that is. Well, it tells you right there. Which stands for the Order of Eastern Templars, the Knights Templar. And this Theodore Royce told Crowley that he had given away the greatest secret in occult history. And Crowley said, "What do you mean? I don't even understand it." So the guy promptly initiated him on the spot to the 9th degree of the Ordo Templi Orientis, and it explained the secret to him. The secret is that a mason, as a mason, you are promised immortality. What do they get? Where do they get their promise of immortality? Simply the secret that Crowley uncovered, probably through demonic intervention, is the secret that this immortality is conveyed through tantric sex magic. And the kind of sex magic that we're talking about here, unfortunately, is the sexual violation of a little child. Crowley taught that the way you can live forever was by vampirizing little children sexually. Masons are doing this. Not all Masons, probably 1 in 100 knows about this, but this is a significant problem among them. This is why the Masons believe that they will live forever. They think every time they defile a child and they steal some of that child's youth, what happens then is that they believe that they are accessing alternate universes, alternate realities where they can become as gods. Everything in magic, like everything in the occult, has its yin and yang, its positive and its negative, its good and evil. There's always this dynamism. And so therefore, just like there's a tree of life, there's also a tree of evil. This is called the cleefolt in Hebrew, which translated means harlots. Here is what is ultimately involved. There is a belief that through this sexual perversion they can access these tunnels into alternate universes, alternate realities. The goal of this kind of magic is to find your own universe and become the god over that universe. This buys into the modern day physics theory that there's many dimensions of reality. Maybe you've read about that, alternate universes. It shows up in science fiction a lot. And then once you're the god of this universe, you can start sucking the energy out of it, and you can use that energy through this child to live forever. And there are men, I have met several. This is not coming from me, by the way. This is a quote from a YouTuber. Just so you know, because it's saying I read about that. I didn't read about that. I just read about what he said. Anyway, alternate universes. It shows up in science fiction a lot. So, let me find where I left off here. I've met several that claim to be hundreds of years old, and this broad general genre of magic is called transugothian magic. And all of that means is that it's a magic that goes into transplutonian space beyond the planet Pluto, which they believe is beyond the pale of the sun, and therefore beyond the pale of the Judeo-Christian God. They believe there are gods out beyond Pluto that are far more powerful and far more dangerous and far more deadly than God and the devil. And that's what these men are trying to access. This is such a problem that I know of about 5. This is not me again. I know that I now know five national support groups that are helping people that are survivors of Masonic sexual abuse. I'm sorry, ritual abuse, which is the same thing apparently. Okay, so Aleister Crowley. Okay, many people say he wasn't a murderer. They say that he was misunderstood and all this other stuff. Well, he's not. He's I would say that without almost any doubt at all, this guy was a murderer, and here's why. Aleister Crowley. There's a book that was written about it. So, Aleister Crowley was almost certainly a murderer. Says Joe, way back in the 20s and 30s, many Londoners were convinced that the city was cursed. By what do you say? King Tut, of course. It so happens that the tomb of the boy king was first uncovered by British archaeologist Howard Carter. This is where the alleged curse of Tutankhamun started. Done deal, right? Wrong. Well, apparently there was more to it than just a silly curse. That more allegedly came from the form of Aleister Crowley, who was a well-known nut job, occultist, in the late 19th and 20th century. Historian Mark Bainan contends in his new book that Crowley was in fact obsessed with Jack the Ripper and subsequently became a copycat serial killer. Mr. Bainan, who had access to a great deal of unpublished works, including Crowley's diary, has drawn some startling parallels between the Ripper and Crowley. Read on as Bainan talks about the murders he credits to Crowley, as well as some other interesting details. Curse of Tutankhamun may have been work of the Satanist killer. 6 mysterious London deaths, famously attributed to the curse of Tutankhamun, were actually murders by notorious Satanist Aleister Crowley. A historian claims in a new book. I'm screwing this up. Incredible parallels between Crowley and Jack the Ripper have also been discovered during research by historian Mark Bainan. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, London was gripped by the mythical curse of Tutankhamun, the Egyptian boy king, whose tomb was uncovered by British archaeologist Howard Carter. More than 20 people linked to the opening of the pharaoh's burial chamber in Luxor in 1923 bizarrely died over the following years. 6 of them in the capital. Victims include 6 of them in the capital. Victims included Carter's personal secretary, Captain Richard Bethel, who was found dead in his bed from suspected smothering at an exclusive Mayfair club. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, then plunged 7 floors to his death from his St. James apartment, where he reportedly kept tomb artifacts gifted by his son. And Aubrey Herbert, half-brother of Carter's financial backer, Lord Carnarvon, also died suspiciously in a Park Lane hospital shortly after visiting Luxor. At the time, a frenzied press blamed the curse of Tutankhamun for the deaths and speculated on the supernatural powers of the ancient Egyptians. At the time, a frenzied press blamed the curse of Tutankhamun for the deaths and speculated on the... I just read that. But Mr. Bainan has now drawn on previously unpublished evidence to conclude the deaths were all ritualistic killings masterminded by Crowley, an occultist dubbed the wickedest man in the world. After unique analysis of Crowley's diaries, essays, and books, and inquest reports, the armchair detective argues that he was a Jack the Ripper-obsessed copycat killer. Crowley, who called himself the Great Beast, apparently had his own motives to tarnish the legacy of Carter's legendary discovery. The gods and goddesses of Crowley's own religious philosophy, Thelema, were mainly drawn from ancient Egyptian religion. He believed himself to be a prophet of a new age of personal liberty controlled by the ancient Egyptian god Horus. It is likely that he would have found Carter's excavation sacrilegious and wanted revenge. According to Mr. Bainan in his new book, London's Curse, Murder, Black Magic, and Tutankhamun in the 1920s West End, published this week by the History Press, Mr. Bainman pinned several deaths on Crowley, 6 of which took place in London. Raoul Loveday, 16th February 1923, the 23-year-old Oxford undergraduate, was a follower of Crowley's cult at the Sicilian Abbey. He died on the same day at the very hour of Carter's much-publicized opening of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. He died after drinking the blood of a cat sacrificed in one of Crowley's rituals, and Mr. Bainan argues that he was deliberately poisoned. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, 10th July 1923, a 23-year-old Egyptian prince shot dead by his French wife of 6 months, Marie Marguerite, in London's Savoy Hotel shortly after he was photographed visiting the tomb. Mr. Bainan says that Crowley and Marie Marguerite had been lovers in Paris. She was working as a hostess at the Folies Bergère, and he was a regular patron at the same venue. He suggests that Crowley put her up to the shooting. Aubrey Herbert, 23 September 1923. Shortly after Marie Marguerite's acquittal, Aubrey Herbert, the half-brother of Lord Carnarvon, died of blood poisoning after a routine dental operation went suspiciously wrong at his private hospital in Park Lane. He had only recently returned from his own trip to Luxor. Mr. Bainan speculates that Crowley was behind the death and may again have used Marie Marguerite to do his dirty work. Captain Richard Bethel, 15th November 1929, Howard Carter's 46-year-old personal secretary, was found dead in his bed at Mayfair's exclusive bath club. Bethel was said to have been in perfect health. It was initially thought that he died of a heart attack, but his symptoms raised suspicion when he was smothered to death as he slept. Crowley had only recently returned to London and was often a guest of novelist W. Somerset Maugham at the club, or Mom at the club, or something. Lord Westbury, 20 February 1930. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, 77, was believed to have thrown himself off the 7th floor St. James apartment, but Mr. Bainan found that it was practically impossible for an elderly man to have climbed onto the window ledge and suggests that Crowley threw him off. Edgar Steele, 24 February 1930. Only 4 days later, Edgar Steele, 57, who was in charge of handling the tomb artifacts at London's British Museum, died at St. Thomas Hospital after a minor stomach operation. Mr. Bainan speculates that Crowley was behind the death. Sir Ernest Wallace Budge, 23 November 1934, a former keeper in the British Museum's Department of Egyptian and Assyrian Antiquities. He was found dead in his bed in Bloomsbury, aged 77. A friend of Lord Carnarvon. He had been responsible for displaying the artifacts from Luxor. Mr. Bainan says there is evidence that Budge and Crowley were associates on the London occult scene. Crowley, who was born into a wealthy upper-class family in 1875, had a controversial doctrine for life of do what thou wilt. The bisexual heroin addict gained notoriety for advocating sexual promiscuity and prostitution, and was dubbed the wickedest man in the world by the press. Mr. Bainan paints a picture of a dangerous schizophrenic known to have murdered his servants in India. Crowley never mentions the deaths in his diaries, but often wrote that his mood had lifted the day after them. He was obsessed with Jack the Ripper, writing numerous essays and poems about him. He socialized with Ripper suspect Walter Sickert, and Mr. Bainan argues that Crowley used the Ripper's killing spree as inspiration for his own efforts years later. Crowley wrote in his diaries that he believed the locations of 5 of the Ripper's murders, in which in Whitechapel in 1888 formed a pentagram, an important star-shaped symbol in Satanism. Mr. Bainan claims that the locations of 5 of Crowley's murders from a copycat pentagram Crowley believed that the Ripper's murders had afforded him special powers, including invisibility. Mr. Bainan says that he thought his murders murders would also render him invisible. To this, it doesn't surprise me. To test this theory, he famously walked through London's Cafe Royal restaurant, ridiculously dressed in a mustard-colored cloak, adorned with occultist symbols. When customers fell silent and were too perturbed to speak to him, he assumed they could not see him. Outlining his macabre theory, Mr. Bainon said, "When I researched these deaths, Crowley's name popped up again and again. There is plenty of circumstantial evidence linking him to all of the deaths, and his diaries and books are riddled with clues linking him to these crimes. I have just put all of the pieces of the jigsaw together. So much of Crowley's belief system was steeped in ancient Egypt. He would have seen the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb as desecration. This was a man given to extensive world travel, and yet we know he was in London when at least 4 of the 6 deaths occurred." He added, "I hope the book will appeal to anyone with an interest in crime or London history. I was fascinated researching London in the 1920s and 1930s. On the surface, it was very glitzy and glamorous, but there was a dark underbelly that provided the ideal stage for this story. Everyone was obsessed with the supposed striking down high society victims. But until now, no one has ever realized that they may well have been murdered. So as you can see, it's most likely that he actually killed countless people here over his insane religion that has absolutely no basis for it, no basis for following." So here's a few quotes from Aleister Crowley, okay? All right. So he says here, "Slay a young child upon the altar, and the blood shall cover the altar with perfume as of roses. Then shall the master, Satan, appear." And this is from his book called The Equinox, apparently. And this is him here. Now, before we continue, let's read this. It says, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to tell you. So this is the little list of rules. You know how the Christians have the 10 Commandments. Well, Satanists have their own little thing too, and they call it the 11 Satanic Rules of the Earth. And in the list, we have here that it says that do not harm young children. It says here number 9, do not harm young children. Interesting that this is 11 long, and 9 is the one that deals with children. So 9/11, which is apparently some symbolic meaning in the occult. But do not harm young children. You know, why young children? How old is young? You know, so who knows what he's really saying or what he really thinks? But this pretty clearly indicates he does not really feel this way. This is what Anton LaVey came up with, I guess, or the followers of Anton LaVey, which is a atheistic type of Satanism that came later. This is theistic Satanism, best I can tell, and this is atheistic Satanism down here. I believe that, I have quotes saying that he believes in Satan. So the idea that there's any doubt at all that Aleister Crowley might be just an atheistic Satanist, not true. He may have tried to preside as one. He was literally a Satan worshiper, as in worshiping him, Satan as a real entity. And now here we have some other quotes of Aleister Crowley and company. Says here that the animal should therefore be killed within the circle and the triangle. For the highest spiritual working, one must choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. That's from his book Magick in Theory and Practice. So if anyone wants to check this stuff out, there you go. There's another one. This one right here should be concerning everybody. Well, all of this should concern everybody, but this is a really big one. This is like indicative of World War III. There is a magical operation of maximum importance, the initiation of a new aeon, the New Age. When it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood. Before man is ready to accept the law of Thelema, The great war must be fought. This bloody sacrifice is the critical point of the world ceremony of the proclamation of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, as Lord of the Aeon, from Aleister Crowley's book, The Book of the Law. So there you go. War is sacrifice. It's literally blood sacrifice. It says it right here. So we can know that for sure, that this is what they've done with World War I and World War II. And from all I can understand, the quotes from Crowley, Thomas Paine, and Albert Pike altogether prove that they literally are planning World War III. And we have a quote from Anton LaVey for those who think that atheistic Satanism is any better. The question arises, who then would be considered... Did I just do that one? Oops, I got that wrong. Oh, no, that was right. I'm sorry. So the question arises, who then would be considered a fit and proper human sacrifice, and how is one qualified to pass judgment on such a person? The answer is brutally simple. Anyone who has unjustly wronged you. Well, that could range from a good and wide gamut. I mean, that's a lot of people. You think about how many people have wronged me in my life. Well, if this guy's law was, the way things were, there'd be a lot of people without a life. But anyhow, I'm not saying I would do it, and I'm not saying that it's acceptable, but I'm saying that this guy is a nutball. So that's from page 49 of his book, The Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey's book. Now, number 9 says, do not harm small children. Okay, we heard about that. And that sounds all fine and good in some respect, but what's this little word right here? Small, okay? So that's probably been deliberately left subjective, only to sound better, but to leave a huge loophole so they can still sacrifice children. Of course, according to all this crap here, right? Kill them, kill over and over again, right? That's what they really believe. I don't care if you're theistic or atheistic. This is what they really adhere to. This kind of crap, right? This stuff right here, excuse me for using that word for the 1000th time. I need to stop using it. This is a cover-up. This is a backstory. This is a way to get out of legal trouble if something happens. It's been deliberately left subjective only to sound better, but to leave a huge loophole so they can still sacrifice children. What about large children? What about young children who are big for their age? What defines how small is small, right? 3 months old, 2 years old, who knows? Aleister Crowley proves that these 11 rules are leaving a loophole and that Satanists kill children as he encouraged child sacrifice many times. In fact, their primary mantra states, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, which indicates that the law regarding not harming small children isn't a rule at all. So as you can see, it is all reflecting Aleister Crowley's psychopathic lunacy, and it's no better. Okay, so I think we've read everything now. So do I have any other thoughts on it? They try to say that atheistic Satanism is so good and that there's nothing wrong with it. Seems like I had something else to add. I'm trying to remember before I go ahead and end this. They plan on World War III, obviously, and I'll get into that in another essay in more detail eventually. But these 3 people here, and there's probably a lot more in it, are deliberately intending they are going to stage World War III. But I guess that's everything. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching.